Great, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Casey Ross. I'm the National Technology Correspondent for Stat News. And I'm going to be moderating a discussion today on the policy implications for the use of AI in healthcare. So we're going to be thinking about how to ensure equity through the regulation of AI, how to remove bias, how to ensure that the regulatory process is surfacing important questions that bear on how these products work in the marketplace and whether they work for everyone. And we've got a great panel today. I'm going to try to end around 2 o'clock, and I'll take some questions from the audience. So feel free to submit those, and I'll try to incorporate them as I go along. And rather than sort of going into introductions, I'm going to let everybody introduce themselves, all of the panelists, and I'm going to start sort of by asking a question to begin, and we'll let people take it up in turn. And the question is, AI can remove bias in healthcare, or it can perpetuate it. And the line in between those outcomes is thin, and it turns on what sometimes are technical choices. So based on your research and experiences, what are the most important questions for regulators to be asking as they seek to regulate these products? And feel free to start with an introduction of yourselves and then go right in. But Kadija, I'd like you to take that up first.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to be on this panel and be a part of the conference today. My name is Kadija Ferryman. I am an assistant professor of ethics and engineering at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering. And I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, and my research centers on the kind of social, cultural, and ethical implications of health information technologies. So to this question of what needs to be considered when we are thinking about regulating health technologies, this is a really important and exciting area, the regulation of health technology. So as some of the previous panels have shown, there is a lot of really important and interesting discussion around bias and data collection, and how do we improve those processes so the tools themselves, when they're used clinically, are being used fairly. But this area of regulation, of actual kind of policy development, is still really in its kind of infancy at this point. So there is, which is good, because there's a lot of opportunity for this policy to be created with and developed with these ideas around fairness and justice at the forefront, as opposed to having these policies kind of being developed and then working to try to undo some of the policy regulations. So in a word, I would say one of the key areas for policy regulation of AI in health is around health equity. And I'll let others say a little bit more, but that is kind of, for me, one of the key areas and one of the key kind of sets of ideas that can be operationalized really throughout the process of developing AI and through in the policy development pipeline. So I will pause there, but I have some more to say about that.
Berkman, would you like to go next?
Yes, sure. My name is Berkman Sahiner, and I'm a senior research scientist. Can you hear me? Okay, and I'm a senior research scientist with the Division of Imaging, Diagnostics, and Software Reliability within the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA. I'm an engineer by training. I have a PhD in electrical engineering and computer science from the University of Michigan. I have been in my position at the FDA for over 10 years. And before that, I was an associate professor of radiology with the University of Michigan. So first, I'd like to start out by thanking the organizers for inviting me and all the participants. I have been listening intently since the beginning, and I believe I have learned a lot. and I look forward to sharing what I have learned here with others at the FDA. As I mentioned, I'm a research scientist and a technical expert at the FDA, so sometimes I might tend to delve into technical and statistical details, but I hope that none of those details should distract from the very important goal of this conference, which is how do we minimize inequities that might be introduced by AI to a health care system that has already biased outcomes based on race or sex or other groupings, and how can AI be hopefully used to diminish the already existing inequities. So the first thing I'd like to mention is that not all products used in healthcare are devices regulated by the FDA, or some may be devices, but they may be products for which FDA exercises enforcement discretion. For example, a software that provides drug-drug interactions and relevant safety information based on demographics data, clinical information, and current medications may not be a device, even if it uses AI. Likewise, the patient targeting algorithm that Dr. Obermeyer discussed earlier in the morning may be a non-device by FDA's definition of a device, or maybe under enforcement discretion. The reason I'm bringing this up is just to say that there is a need to discuss bias for healthcare used in AI used in clinics that's not regulated by FDA as well. So in the past few years, the FDA issued a number of guidance documents encouraging the correction and evaluation of data from diverse patient populations. These guidance documents, evaluation of sex-specific data in medical device clinical studies, collection of race and ethnicity data in clinical trials, and evaluation and reporting of age, race, and ethnicity-specific data in medical clinical studies, provide recommendations to improve the quality, consistency, and transparency of data regarding the performance of medical devices within specific sex, age, racial, and ethnic groups. To achieve an unbiased estimate of treatment effect or diagnostic performance in the general population, sponsors should develop a strategy to enroll diverse populations and include representative populations based on the intended use of the device. So I believe that these guidances are extremely useful, but they are only part of the questions regulators may be asking as we regulate AI products that may have a potential for bias. So from an equity point of view, I believe that the most important question is how well does the product work for subpopulations where one might suspect that there's a systemic difference. So I'd like to unpack this a bit. And first of all, there are, of course, many more dimensions to device evaluation in addition to equity. So this is just one subset of questions. Second, I'd like to reiterate that since we're talking about bias, in statistics, bias is a general concept that can happen for a number of subpopulations. So today we're talking about mostly race, ethnicity, and sex, but for some products, patient age could be a cause of bias. Maybe for some products, patient weight would be a cause for bias. So domain knowledge, understanding what a product does and how it was trained is critical to asking the right questions. It's very important to understand what goes into a product and what comes out of it. How objective is the target variable that was used to train the algorithm in the case of AI? So I thought that the presentation by Dr. Obermeyer this morning was very instructive. In the example that he gave, you first need to understand that what goes into the original algorithm for training is the cost incurred by the patient rather than the number of active chronic health conditions a patient has. But once you understand this, then the questions you can ask become much clearer. Lastly, I'd like to say that it's important to understand some causality aspects of the condition that the device is addressing. Sometimes being a member of a subpopulation is a direct cause of bias. Sometimes it's an indirect cause, and there are confounding factors that explains the difference. Sometimes, as discussed in earlier presentations, race is not an explicit variable that goes in as an input to an algorithm, but there is bias that shows up as a result of dependence on other variables. So again, coming back to your question, I would say that the most important question is how well the product works for subpopulations where one might suspect there is a systemic difference. In addition, it's important for device manufacturers to describe the composition of their training data sets, because many of these biases may root from the selection of the data set. So I might come back to this point later if there's time. And finally, it's important to ask how objective is the target for training is, and to find out if there is a possibility that maybe already existing established inequities in healthcare may have creeped into that training target, or may have creeped into the data used to train the algorithm. So I'll stop here.
Najat, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, everyone. I'm Najat. I'm the Chief Data Science Officer for Janssen R&D, and I also chair our Johnson & Johnson Data Science Council. So again, focus on driving the adoption of data science across many different sectors within J&J. You know, I think the points that Berkman and Kadija brought up are really good ones, and I'll build on a couple. But before I get there, I mean, the objective, right, for us as a healthcare company is always, how do we discover and develop medicines that, and while we're doing that, that actually represent the patients in the real world that we're going to treat. So I mean, that's the crux of anything that we do, whether it's a clinical trial that we're trying to run, or whether it's being able to detect patients earlier using different AI machine learning algorithms. If it's the central core to what one does, I mean, I think, you know, Casey, you asked a question around, you know, from a regulation perspective, what are the questions to ask? For me, it almost starts at, even when you build an algorithm, even when you go after a question, Berkman, you're spot on in terms of what is the question, and having that domain expertise to make that as precise as possible, that you need to start thinking about what's the representative data set that you can even start. Because we all know garbage in, garbage out. I mean, this is stating the obvious here. So it's almost, for me, what are the fundamental good practices that we as a, you know, company, academic institution, whatever it might be in the healthcare space, start off with? And it really starts with the data. And I've heard some of the conversations in the prior panels around the challenges with some of the data sets, right? That there is sometimes inherent bias that exists in the data set to begin with. But we have to be extremely systematic in looking at the data set, understanding that, you know, sometimes large, commonly used data sets have inherent bias based on their geographical representation, based on, you know, the types of data you're getting claims versus EHR. So the onus, I feel, is on us to first start, not just take whatever data set is a large volume and available, but be really thoughtful about how do you, I hate to use this word, but almost cobble together a representative data set. And I use that word because our data sets, as we all know, are extremely fragmented in the US. I mean, it's just the reality. Those are your fixed constraints. So how do you manage against it? So whenever my teams are starting any use case, that's the first question I go. And then you have to cut it to say, okay, from a racial perspective, and there are challenges because it's not accurately recorded, but also many gender, many other different variables that you might look at, that it is equally represented, not just in your total data set, but in your test and your training data set. And then you actually look to generalize it as much as possible. I think that's a very important start. The second piece, so if it's important to build it that way, I think from a regulation perspective, Berkman articulated it better than I can. Those are the sort of questions from a transparency perspective one should be asking, which is, well, how were the data sets created, right? And how did we ensure that they're as representative as possible? I think the second piece is also around the algorithms, right? You want to have machine learning fairness. It's a topic, it's a term that's being used a lot in recent, I would say, last 2-3 years. But the question is really around, you know, not just using one methodology, right? But at least using 2 or 3 to triangulate and see, you know, are you seeing different outcomes? A lot of the retrospective testing, if done well, I think is going to be critical to what are the outputs we're getting. And sometimes you absolutely have to say, you know what? we can't, it's a no-go. We just don't have the right data set. We don't have, we're getting a lot of variability in our outcomes. We can't actually trust the algorithm. I think, again, that's another good practice that we need to adopt in everything that we do. And if we do it that way, again, that's something that can be asked. And then the two other points I'd like to make, around deployment, I do think the feedback loop of actually being able to deploy something and seeing how it's doing and back testing, I'm a firm believer of that. I don't think that's actually done enough. And I think that's why having strategic partnerships, whether it's with large medical centers or, partners, whoever it might be, to be able to back test and really see that are there any in the real world, because there might be unintended variables that just were not there, and being transparent on that and this continuous loop to improve it. And one thing that doesn't get talked enough about, I think, is while you do all of these three steps, it's so important to have a diverse team that's actually working on each of those steps. I can't emphasize that enough, because at the end of the day, a lot of the bias that creeps in is human bias, it's structural bias, there's so much that goes on there. But having folks that are thinking with that first, because it's not optional, right? This is something that should be inbuilt in terms of how we do any of our algorithms, how we build it, deploy it, etc. That's really important. So, as an example, when my team was developing the machine learning algorithm to determine and predict where the COVID hotspots were going to be many months in advance as we were developing our vaccine, and this was done actually in partnership with MIT, Dr. Berkman's lab, the team that worked on it was highly diverse, racial, gender, and that's not because they were cherry picked that way, because my entire team, half is women, and much more gender and racial diversity than what we see for industry standards. That's really important, because then you're really thinking about that across the way, and it's not an SOP that you're just following, but it's part and practice of how you live and do data science. So those are some of the thoughts. And if we do that right, I think we can actually have the right evidence for regulatory and other purposes. As Kadija is right, it's still evolving, but then we can shape it the right way.
And Neale, why don't you go ahead and just to remind everybody, we're talking about the sort of most important questions for regulators to be asking, as they seek to regulate AI products.
Thank you, Casey. I am delighted and honored to be on this panel and to talk with all of you about these important issues. My name is Neale Mahoney. I'm a health economist and a professor at Stanford University. And in thinking about these issues, I should say my research, I'm thinking about how we can use regulation and incentives to lower costs and improve quality to increase equity in the US healthcare system. In thinking about AI in particular, I think a key question is whether we want the regulation and the incentives sort of upstream on inputs at the level of AI, or to what extent we want the regulation and incentives downstream for process measures, achieving equity in cancer screening rates, for health outcomes. And this debate between regulating and incentivizing inputs and outputs, I think, is a core economic debate we see in many industries. If you think about education, do we incentivize test scores, or do we regulate class size and teacher credentials? And I think that trade-off is going to hopefully come up in our discussion over the next 30 minutes as well. So I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. And I wanted to, this is something that a number of speakers has already touched upon, but I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into what do we need to know? And by us, I mean the public in general. What do we need to know about the data used to train and validate AI products used in healthcare? The FDA, to Berkman's point, has called for device makers generally, and not just talking about AI, but device makers broadly, to disclose the racial and gender makeup of study populations. Does that need to be a mandate when you're talking about the use of AI in healthcare? What does the public need to know here, and what should regulators be requiring in terms of disclosure about the data used to train and validate? Kadija, do you want to take that one up?
Sure. And I'll answer that, and also co-sign on the previous comments that were made by my fellow panelists. I think echoing what folks have said already in this panel and also in the previous panels. Of course, some way of ensuring or kind of communicating to the public that the data being used for these tools are representative, have been somehow screened for what my colleague Melissa McCradden calls pernicious bias, right? So those, I think, are two main assurances that could be given, right? That the data has somehow been audited for pernicious biases and the samples are representative. But I think in addition to just sort of thinking about the data, I think it's also really important to for regulatory agencies like the FDA to communicate to the public how stakeholders have been involved in this process of auditing and reviewing these tools. And I know there have been some efforts at the FDA within other parts of kind of regulatory policy to bring in patients, to bring in other stakeholders at various parts of developing policy. And so I think that would be something really important for regulators to work on and to communicate is how do we bring in, and so this kind of goes back to the first question of what kind of questions do we need to be asking about equity in AI and health. We need to be asking about the data, but I think we also need to be asking how do we bring in patients and other stakeholders into this developing regulatory space for AI and health. What would that actually look like? So a review article that I did a couple of months ago suggested that that this could be part of a kind of regulatory process that has health equity as a focus. And what would that look like if we were to kind of really operationalize that suggestion? How could other stakeholders be brought in to advise, to participate in the development of regulatory policy for AI in health? So, for example, one of the things that I kind of include, and I have a kind of reimagining of the proposed regulatory pathway right now for AI in health, and there's the kind of data bias review part, right? But there's also model validation, which is part of the proposed regulatory pathway right now. And we could think very specifically about how we could bring stakeholders into even the model validation process. And typically, if you're from, we can think of that as kind of a technical set of tasks, right? Validating models, but how could we bring stakeholders in? How can we bring stakeholders in and put the questions to them to say, okay, even if we have data that is free of bias or has biases that we know of and we're correcting for them, we still have other decisions that we need to make about this model. We still have other decisions that we need to make about what kinds of trade-offs we're going to make between equalized odds or positive predictive rates, right? And those questions, those kind of technical model validation questions, really have, again, sort of downstream real world impacts on people, especially if they are from different marginalized communities. So we can imagine, of course, contexts where those kinds of trade-offs that we kind of would make in a model validation process, if we get input from other stakeholders, we could, calibrate the model in this way or calibrate it in this way. We can't do both, right? We often know that some of these fairness decisions that are made for AI tools, you can't include every kind of fairness. So what would that look like to bring in stakeholders to have them give their voice, their opinion, their thoughts on these decisions around model validation, right? So it's not just the data, right, and ensuring that our data is good, but then further down in that process where there are other decisions that could be made, how do we bring other people in, other voices in to these conversations that we typically think of as just in the realm of those with technical expertise?
Casey, can I just jump in on a comment that Kadija made? I mean, Kadija, I think it's such a good point, and just to build on that, right? In order to ensure like the downstream piece of what exactly do we focus on, because there's so many interdependent things we're looking at, I think the intent of why even we built the algorithm becomes really important, because there's different categories of intent, right? Like one could be, how do you use an AI machine learning model for earlier detection of patients, as an example, right, with a rare disease, which is a huge challenge because people get misdiagnosed all the time. And you want to ensure that algorithm is treating that early detection equally across different subgroups, as you were saying. But that would be a really, there you want to make sure your data is representative. You want to make sure you're probably looking at prospective data to test and back test that the outcomes are right. But then there are other, just as a bookend, right? I can't go through every example, but as a bookend, there are other examples where, let's take clinical trials, right? I mean, COVID has put a lens on it, but this has been true for a decade or more, which is the underrepresentation of minorities in clinical trials. And what do we generally do? We realize, oh gosh, we don't have enough diverse patients. We operationally try to fix that problem at the end. That's not really the right way to do it. You can actually use AI for good, which is why not use the data sets we have, use the machine learning models to, in the very beginning, be able to over-index on regions where we know that there are more racial diversity, socioeconomic. I mean, we do that with a lot of our models. We did that with the COVID-19 vaccine model because we wanted to not just talk about, hey, we want to have a diverse trial, but let's have the data drive us and using an AI. So there you're intentionally doing that because you want to pick up on a gap that for many reasons has existed, but how do you use data to do it the right way? Not just patients, but then also investigators, right? How do you generate the next set of principal investigators who are also diverse themselves? There's a gap there that hasn't been fixed. So I just think it's just an example that, depending on the intent, then you look at the downstream impact and see what actually holds up as the most important objective that you're trying to address. And the last thing that I think, Neale, you mentioned as well, which is, do we do this more downstream or more upstream? Like from the experience I've had to date, some of the pre-specification conversations with regulatory bodies has been really, really helpful, where you can actually have initial feasibility around the data set you have, what's the representation, distribution, and really be transparent of where there might be gaps, and therefore what you can and cannot do. Those earlier conversations have helped a lot in terms of defining what the design of the algorithm and then the deployment plans have looked like. So just an encouragement that I found that to be very, very helpful as we're still evolving in this space.
Yeah, Berkman, go ahead. I'd love to hear from you.
Yes.
Because I'm assuming during the regulatory process, you're learning a lot more than you can probably disclose about the models that are developed and are ultimately commercialized. So tell us how the FDA is thinking about this.
Yeah, so I first like to, I think, go back to a point that Kadija made that's, I think, really very important. And that's the fact that these devices really live in an ecosystem that involves, of course, the patients, the clinicians, the device sponsor or the companies and the regulators. And I think involving all stakeholders, maybe at different points in the life cycle of a product, is extremely important. And the FDA has a committee called the Patient Engagement Advisory Committee, or PEAC, that was established to help assure that the needs and experience of patients are included as part of FDA's deliberations. And this past year, the focus topic of that committee was AI in healthcare. So one of the ideas that Kadija mentioned, for example, to have, how can we have patients involved, maybe even in the design of these data sets, while the companies are really starting to look at a problem, how do we do it at the beginning so that when a product comes to the FDA, it already has that, I think, approval or a look at it by various patient subgroups is, I think, a great question. And I think, yeah, data sets are definitely extremely important. And as mentioned earlier, this is a relatively newer topic. So there are, at the FDA, devices are not regulated as to whether they are AI-based or non-AI-based. Most of these devices are what are called 510K devices that have some predicate on the market that has a similar function and similar risk. So devices that involve AI, when they come to the FDA, they are reviewed by different review divisions or different offices. And based on the precedent or based on the predicate that the device is based on, the data that's made available to the public when that device is cleared by the FDA may differ, because again, that's the precedent that comes with it. And the precedent has shown, this type of data. So we might believe that the new product may also have the same kind of data. So this maybe creates some inconsistency in reporting, different characteristics of the data sets when the FDA, issues their clearance. So now, since late last year, we have a new Center of Excellence, the Digital Health Center of Excellence, that is designed to answer many of the questions related to digital health, as well as coordinating the efforts in AI. So with that, I think we're hoping that we would have more consistency in reporting results as to the, for example, the makeup of the data set, et cetera, for devices that do all kinds of different functions. So it's a work in progress.
And I wanted to jump to a question I had for Neale. Is it enough to know that an AI does what its developer says it does in terms of technical performance, or do we need to know more about that model? Should product sponsors be required to study the impacts of their models on real patients prospectively, or does analysis of retrospective data suffice? And if the answer to that turns on the nature and use of the product, then how do you draw that line?
Yeah, thank you, Casey. This is a really excellent question. It actually got me a little bit stuck. Let me tell you why I think this is such an important and difficult question. So, in the use cases that I know for AI, I think the bias of the algorithm is sort of fundamentally non-separable from the context in which it's used. And so I'll give you a specific example which relates to my research. So I work on sort of payment reform for hip and knee replacement. So there's about 500,000 hip and knees replaced that are paid for by Medicare in the US. A key decision is after surgery, do you send somebody to a nursing home, which will cost about $10,000, they'll spend 20 days there, or do you send them home, perhaps with home health aid? That decision is increasingly being made using risk stratification using AI. So why is it difficult to think about bias here? Because you can think in different contexts, the bias reducing decision is different. So suppose some part of the country, nursing homes generate really poor outcomes for minority patients. I think we have evidence that suggests that in those settings, you might not want to send a marginal patient to a nursing home. You might want to send them home. In other settings, you can imagine nursing homes generate good outcomes for everybody, people's home situations, perhaps because of sort of historical inequities in housing markets are worse for minority patients. And so the equity enhancing thing is to send patients to nursing homes. You can imagine urban, rural, north, south, differences in what is the best option for different patients groups. Given that, what does it mean for the risk stratification, the AI, to be bias reducing? Really depends upon whether you're using this algorithm in Cleveland or in Memphis or in Boston or in the Bay Area where I live. Given that, it seems like we need to be focusing on downstream outcomes, not on the AI in the training data set in which it was developed. Otherwise, we're not going to actually be able to push the needle on what we care about. So that's where I am. Maybe this is, not a representative new use case, but I do think that if that is right, then I think the regulation that flows from it is make it really easy for hospital systems to evaluate the AI in their context. So like when I work with banks with consumer finance data, I can't get FICO scores because there's a separate licensing process, separate fees. And so I can't basically study the AI that the bank is using for their decision. In healthcare, I think we need to set things up so that if I get data from Stanford, I don't need to bring in a separate set of lawyers and go through a separate contracting process to get access to the AI that Stanford's using. I think we need to have great disclosure on how these systems are, how the AI is trained, but I don't think we should assume that sort of the training data set tells us about the context in which it's being used, because those are varied. Yeah, so that's where I am in thinking about these things. I don't know, again, if this is just sort of my experience or if this is a broader concern.
Neale, one thing I'll say to that is it's true, right? Whatever your training data set is, it's never big enough. I mean, one bridge in between that we think about is actually validating that algorithm, whatever the intent is, in a representative set of sites. So let's say you pick 4 hospital systems and you try to pick them to be as representative as possible and actually do a proper validation, which is the prospective piece, validating it, back testing. Sometimes it's just operational features too. Sometimes it's around the context like you were explaining. There's so many factors. It's hard to get it right all the way, but I think even doing that as a bridge gives us a lot more data in terms of how to do it well, and also gets you more, real world practice of this algorithm, and gets, a lot of the times we have PIs who are champions, patients who are champions. So that sort of, Kadija, what you were saying, bringing them in the process earlier, that's another way to do it in parallel fashion as well.
And I just want to just to add to those comments, I think it's the downstream, looking at the downstream cases are important, as well as the upstream, and also sort of seeing the interactions between those. So even using the case that Neale gave of, an AI risk stratification, this scoring system sort of depends on what nursing homes versus home care looks like in particular areas. But I don't know this, but I could imagine, that there are upscale or upstream characteristics that could matter in a case like this as well. So there was some research done recently, sort of looking at differences in how Black patients rate their pain and comparing those with their MRIs, and sort of some of the reasons for differences in scoring. There are of course, ways that there are racial corrections made in all kinds of clinical settings that are part of the data, again, kind of getting back to these inherent biases. So you could have a case potentially where due to some clinical racial correction, certain minority groups could be listed already as less at risk, let's say, for complications. They would get put into a lower risk group, and then something like the AI risk scoring tool would say, okay, and for people in this range of risk, would they do better at a nursing home or at home? But already who gets to be put into that higher risk category is already, impacted by racial corrections that are built in kind of earlier clinically. So I think it's important to sort of see the interaction between some of these kind of upstream data biases as well as the downstream use cases. And this sort of goes back to the point that Berkman made earlier about thinking about the kind of ecosystem of regulation. One of the things that I mention is that I write about is kind of the post-market evaluation, right? Which is something that's of course been part of FDA regulatory policy for some time. But again, thinking about it specifically in the domain of AI and health, if we were to keep health equity central, what would a post-market evaluation look like? What kinds of questions would we need to ask? So this question of, does the AI work? It could be, depending on the goals for the product, better outcomes on a particular health indicator, more people going in for testing, but are there differences within subgroups or within populations? We know, for example, that doctors often, don't recommend preventative testing for racial minorities as often as they do for others. So we could see a case where, overall, more people are being recommended. Let's say it's an AI tool that's some kind of screening test, but there are some groups, if you kind of dig into that real when you're doing that post-market evaluation, who are actually not being seen, or the differences, the gaps in who is actually being referred to that for those screening tests is increasing. So that's another part of that process that I think it's important to think about as well.
And Berkman, I wondered if you could jump in here just to talk a little bit about how the FDA is approaching this question, particularly as it relates to end users of, an approved commercial algorithm by the FDA. You can't just bring it into your environment and retrain it and then redeploy it, right? Because then you'd have to come back to the FDA for approval of that. So how is the FDA sort of thinking about that process and that continuum, in the post-market realm when these products make their way into the marketplace?
Yeah, I think post-market is a very important area, especially in AI, because as we often hear from other speakers and others, that there is something called a shift, for example, data set shift. It might be between the difference between the training data set or even the original evaluation data set before the device comes to the FDA, and after what happens in the clinic, that might be somewhat different from the data set that the device was trained on, because sometimes things change in time, or sometimes the clinical practice changes, etc. So it's a very important component, and it sort of depends on, I think, the risk of the device. So especially for higher risk devices, I think it will be very important to look at how the device performs once it's on the market, and how it maybe changes with changes that are happening in the health system, as well as something that has not been discussed earlier at this conference. But the fact is that most of these AI algorithms, their design are iterative. So today you might have a data set of 1,000 patients that you have trained your algorithm on. And then once it goes on the market, you might have a larger training set. So the company might want to retrain it. And what happens with that retraining? How has the algorithm evolved? So these are questions that we're interested in. And again, depending on the risk of the device. And again, I would like to emphasize the ecosystem aspect of this, because I think to be able to obtain meaningful data, the companies may need to provide some tools to the clinics to collect that data. The clinic needs to be willing to collect the data, because it might cost them some time and effort. And then how is that data analyzed? Maybe the clinic analyzes it by itself and, makes sure that it is working as intended, or maybe they analyze it jointly with the sponsor. And then how do those results, how how are they made public? Are they really, publicly posted? Sometimes are they transmitted back to the FDA, etc. These are all important questions that we need to think about as an ecosystem.
And I wanted to switch to Najat's realm for a minute because it's such an exciting time right now in terms of drug development, what we've learned and the practices that were taken up during the pandemic, and springboarding off of that, how AI can be incorporated into the drug discovery and drug development processes it's just a really interesting time. In your mind, what guardrails should be placed around the use of AI in drug development and clinical trials, Najat? What uncertainties do manufacturers face in the use of these technologies to improve enrollment, incorporate things like historical control arms? What dangers are there here? Tell us how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, the central mission still remains the same, right? Which is using all of these different sources of real world data or even prior aggregated RCT data. It behooves us to use that to be able to answer multiple questions. Who is going to be a responder, non-responder? There are a lot of new indications and diseases that have high unmet need, and actually difference in terms of racial disparity. The prevalence might be higher actually in minorities. So if you don't use data to basically better understand what's happening in the real world, I feel like we're going to do the same thing that we've done potentially before, which is have trials that don't have the right levels of diversity. Not really being able to understand, even within gender, some of the responses that you see. Why is it different mechanistically, scientifically, biologically, etc. So whether we're talking about clinical trial design or execution, I think we have to use it. Now, the guardrails, as I think about it, is what I mentioned earlier, which is we have to be very thoughtful about how we're using the data. Being transparent, you said, what are some of the uncertainties? One of the uncertainties is having data sets that are really, truly represented, right? Across different diverse, groups, across gender, socioeconomic status. That is not easy, but I think really the external ecosystem has evolved quite a bit in the last couple of years, where more and more of those longitudinal data set, we're starting to get that. But now in terms of the inherent bias sometimes of how often, maybe patients with certain indications that are, minorities are actually, sent for earlier screening, and the difference in those practices, that's difficult to change because that's actually embedded in the data sets that are there. So again, that's why it becomes really important, and I hate to use the word cobble, but to cobble together the right representative data sets, working with many different partners and groups. And sometimes, and that's why, when I think about the external ecosystem, it's about not just being part of it, it's about shaping it, right? How do we ensure that if we're going into bladder cancer, as an example, you have to go earlier on in the disease. So we need to have companies that actually have good urology data sets and oncology data sets are connected. If not, you'll never be able to unlock disease progression as you go earlier in, say, cancer. So maybe a couple of examples, Casey, right? Because I think, it's good to talk about theory, but how does it happen in practice? I think, I'm really passionate about a couple of areas. One is, when it comes to early detection, we really need to think about how we can use the signatures in real world data using AI and machine learning to be able to detect that earlier. And the bigger the data sets you have, the more robust subgroup analysis you can do, whether it's gender, different diversity, etc. If not, we just cannot do that. So let's take PH as an example. It's a rare disease, more in women in their mid-30s, and they get misdiagnosed for 5 to 7 years because there is discrimination in terms of how women are treated and men are treated. That's the truth. So how do we account for that? So we needed to have a data set that had enough number from a gender perspective, racial diversity perspective, and then it's not enough to just build an algorithm. We need to work with partners in health systems so we can actually do little pilots, see how it's working. This takes longer, which I know isn't the cool answer, but it's a much more thorough, rigorous way of building something that if we can shave off the diagnosis gap by 2 years, 3 years, there are medicines on the market that could fundamentally change the outcomes for those patients. That's why you do it. So all of the guardrails that I mentioned, Casey, before, but it doesn't, we cannot let that stop us from doing it. We just have to be really thoughtful about how we do it. There are a few other disease areas where we haven't built algorithms because the data set is just not appropriate. So you have to be transparent of where you can't do it, and then keep seeing if the data sets are evolving, if the algorithms are evolving. So that's one piece. And then actually having partners who are willing to deploy it, even in pilot mode, learning from it, because I think we can all say here we're in a learning process. It's an exciting time, but I also want to be practical that it is a learning inflection point that we're going through. But if it's something that other industries, like you said, I think insurance, Neale, right, have gone a decade ago. It's time for us to do the same here. And then the other one I'll mention is diversity in clinical trials. I think there was a chat question around it. I will address it in terms of now. You know, this started for us before COVID-19. We have a whole effort around how do we increase diversity and inclusion in our clinical trial. Again, if we don't test our medicine or vaccine in what the patient makeup really looks like in the real world, we're doing ourselves a disservice. We're not building the best medicine we can. So that's core to what we do. But how do you do that? So COVID-19 was a great springboard, you know, using our machine learning model. Basically, it incorporated what you would incorporate technically and traditionally, you know, epidemiological data, but then add on to that social compliance, being able to predict that 4 months in advance was extremely hard at a county level, not a country level or a state level. Being able to incorporate socioeconomic, racial diversity. So we over-index. The recommendations of the models were like 80–90% in areas that have higher than census racial diversity. Makes a difference, you know, when you look at the outcomes downstream, and I like the fact that we could look at our outcomes in a shorter period of time than usually what happens in a clinical trial. You see that 90% of those predictions were accurate, and we had a very, very diverse trial, higher than census numbers. That's huge. Now we should not do that for one trial. We should. My vision is to do that for every single trial that we have. That is representative, not just an average, but for that disease, for that indication. For that, I need that real world data to understand what that epidemiological distribution really looks like to begin with, and then parlay that into the trials. Now, data science and AI is one option. Our ops team does a great job on the boots on the ground. So I don't want to say there's only one tool to do it, but imagine if we can do that early on in terms of the locations we go, the sites we pick, we build the next generation of investigators that are diverse. That's how you actually change the picture, not for one program, or not for one medicine, one asset, but actually how you fundamentally run clinical trials. I think we're at the cusp of being able to do that, and I don't see why we shouldn't. Again, you have to be very mindful about how we use the data, algorithms, etc. But if we don't push on that, I don't think anybody else would, right? If we're not talking about it and doing something about it, then we're going to have the same conversation in a few years, and that's not acceptable.
Well, I want to thank you for taking that question out of the chat. You're making my job easy, Najat. So that was awesome. Does anybody else want to jump in there on that one, or should I move on to the next? Well, let me move on to the next one because this is one that's come up in the conversation already, and it'll also take the onus off of Berkman a little bit because this is not necessarily in the FDA's realm, but this has to do with the work that Ziad Obermeyer and his team have done, and I wrote about it a little bit earlier this year as well, and I think it's such an important question because insurers and providers are soaking up data from a biased and very unfair world, and they're using it to make decisions about the care of people. And I'm wondering if there needs to be tighter regulation in this space. So to put it to you, Neale, when you're thinking about using this data to make decisions, which has huge implications on who gets access to care and who doesn't, do these types of models and algorithms need to be regulated and vetted more carefully before they're put into practice?
No, thank you, Casey. I'll try and be quick since I think we're soon running out of time. So thinking about like a specific use case. So Medicare Advantage plans, probably about 25 million elderly, about 40% of the elderly population. Something that really drives these plans' bottom lines are their star ratings, which are based on outcome and process measures. And so if we think about improving equity, let's say in cancer screening rates, I think we can go back to do we want to regulate, incentivize, improved equity upstream in the algorithms, which might be sending people emails or letters to get recommended screenings? Or do we want to focus attention sort of downstream to try and ensure equal screening rates across different groups? And my sense is for a bunch of these outcomes, I think we just want to turn up the dial downstream. And the reason is, we can do, as well as we want upstream in sending people emails and sending doctors best practice alerts. But if there are issues in access to care, so certain patient groups, can't go to a doctor's office during regular work hours, they don't have facilities in their neighborhoods, we're never going to close, I think, the really troubling gaps we have. So I think we need to close those gaps. We need the incentives on the outcomes so that the insurers are working not only do I send the right people emails, but do I make sure in my network of providers, I have outpatient clinics in the right neighborhoods that I can put pressure on my doctor's offices to be open on weekends when certain patient groups are able to come. I think otherwise, all the AI in the world is not going to solve this problem. So, I maybe I'll change my mind, but I do think that this access issue is so important that we need to focus downstream to fix that. Otherwise, we're never going to fix the problems we have.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. We are just about out of time, but I kind of wanted to just go around the room really quickly before we wrap up, and just talk about maybe the next thing that's on your plate or an important takeaway from this discussion, that you've had or that, it's whatever work you want to do next. Maybe Berkman, you can sort of start, and then we can just kind of go around just about sort of your next steps.
Thank you. And it has really been very instructive for me to attend this conference. And I'd like to reiterate that the FDA is very much interested in increasing our sphere of knowledge in this fast developing field and working with stakeholders in the topics that were mentioned earlier, some of the issues with bias, of course, but also issues that came up in this panel, things such as what can be done about post-market data collection and real-world evidence, among other topics.
And Najat, you laid out a pretty ambitious agenda there. And the one point I wanted to drill down with you on, just to end with, which I think is a really important point, is the need for diversity in the groups of people that are developing and validating and testing and deploying these algorithms. It's not okay for a group of white guys in Minnesota to make all the rules, right? So what are the next steps that need to be made, in terms of ensuring diversity on the development teams so that there's diversity in the products and fairness in the products?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's one of the core things that I think is important to doing this right. Look, talent, I mean, we can have an hour-long conversation about it, but we need to actually build what I always say bilingual talent in the space that's diverse. What I mean by that is folks that actually understand, have that domain expertise that Berkman was saying, understand the data, understand, like, again, we're having this conversation to improve the outcomes of patients, all patients, right? I mean, that's what we're doing here. So folks that understand that and are proficient in data science, and a lot of the times you'll get either or. So my entire team is full of really folks with complementary background that have both areas of expertise. Even if they over-index in one area, how do you develop? And when I think about that, you can actually have a lot of folks that are from diverse backgrounds. I mean, COVID, one of the nice things about COVID, if I can say, is the fact that we can work remotely. The number of talented individuals I've been able to hire in many different areas that, could not maybe travel to work, have families, or there's other challenges, but are really talented in the data science aspect. That is something that's a differentiation, right? So we have to be willing to think differently, be able to recruit and develop talent, even if they over-index in one area versus the other. And quite frankly, if you're working on the most impactful problems, my experience has been, you actually have more and more talent like that come to your team. It's a osmotic sort of passive approach, of doing and working on the right things. I think that's what we need to do. And this is something we shouldn't just do in data science. We should just do this in every single area, right? The fact that we're talking about it, the fact that what is the industry average for women in data science is below 20%. Like African-American, Latinx is in the single low digits. That's unacceptable, right? So we have to ensure that we are developing folks that maybe are not fully ready from someone else's criteria and investing in them, having them work on really, really important problems that they care about, and we'll see a fundamental shift in the talent that we have. The other thing, again, I would say is those that we partner with, right? The investigators who are actually helping us test these algorithms, or be able to recruit these patients. We have to go beyond like the top 5 institutions that we always work with. We have to go in areas that are more diverse. We have to help them with infrastructure to ensure that we build the next set of investigators. Again, the reason I say all this, Casey, is if we don't do it now, it might sound ambitious, but I think we're so late in the game. If we don't do it now, then we're going to have the same conversation like a few years down the road. And I honestly don't think that's optional. So again, it's not going to be anywhere perfect. We're at the inflection point, but I think as an ecosystem, if we do that, whether it's talent and also in our organizations, but then also in the broader ecosystem, we'll be much better off.
Thank you for that. And Kadija, I thought you made a great point also earlier about stakeholder access to the process, incorporating diverse voices and patient voices into the process of developing and testing these models. What's next for you on that front? What are some important next steps?
Yeah, so for me, the next steps are really kind of thinking more deeply about how we develop policy regulation for AI in health that centers health equity. And so it would, the kind of next steps in that work, so starting out from that perspective that I wrote a few months ago, really digging deeper onto that question. What would policy regulation in the space look like if we centered health equity? So whose voices would we need to include and how do we include them? So for example, if we're even looking at the level of national organizations that focus on minority health, that focus on health policy, like the Black Women's Health Imperative, for example, an organization that's been focused on Black women's health, bringing health equity to the forefront of policy discussions. How would we bring a group like the Black Women's Health Imperative into conversations around regulating AI in health? So those are the kinds of questions that I'm looking at and some of the next steps from my research.
And Neale, your point on assessing outcomes downstream as these products, algorithms, models are incorporated into the environment. What has to happen there? We don't necessarily know how these models are affecting outcomes yet. So much work was done during the course of the pandemic where we don't, even if it seems like a promising technology, we don't yet know how it's impacting care. So what's sort of next there on your plate?
Maybe this is a cop-out, but I think maybe my most important job as an educator is to train and inspire really smart Stanford PhD students to work on these issues. There's only so many things I can do myself. So certainly, making these topics central in my PhD classes to fire up the next generation so that we have the bandwidth to go after these. That's something that I'm focusing on. Maybe just a small step, but what I can do.
Well, thank you guys so much for a really great panel. I'm like 10 minutes over time, so I've got to turn it back to Ignacio now. But again, this is a really great discussion, and I enjoyed talking with all of you.